I thought I'd never want to do this job again.
Take us back. I want to hear your story.
It always sounds a bit cliched that you say, I've wanted to be in media since I was a baby. But weirdly enough, I sort of found myself in that situation. I was never the smartest person in the room. I'd been on so many different paths in a media industry, from being an actor to being a director to being a performer, that sort of has eventually led to the Diary of a CEO. Yeah.
Mistreatment of people within creative industries, and I think that they forget that we are people.
I found myself having regular panic attacks. I would literally be working and crying at the same time. I felt like I couldn't say I felt ill because I had to work. If I did feel ill, I was working anyway.
The trendsetter of podcasting.
What I tend to say is one of the most invaluable tips or hack to becoming an editor is influences so much of what you do.
Anthony, to have you on this interview series and as part of this Creator Burnout conversation, I truly feel that it is an incredible opportunity to share with the people listening what can happen when you step through that burnout, when you find the right path for you. And we're going to explore all of that in this conversation. But before we dive into where you are now and the incredible things that you're doing with the Diary of a CEO and Flight Group and all the kind of different elements that you're involved with, take us back. I want to hear your story from this first steps into the creative journey. What is it that you really started with in this dream of creativity?
Wow. I mean, it always sounds a bit cliched that you say, I've wanted to be in media since I was a baby, or I grew up wanting to be like this, working like talent pools or working acting, things like that. But weirdly enough, I sort of found myself in that situation. I grew up. The crazy thing is, a lot of people see me as an editor and that I must have been doing editing for so long. The truth is, I've only really been an editor as my focus for maybe about 4.5 years now. And prior to that, I'd been on so many different paths in a media industry, from being an actor to being a director to being a performer, that sort of has eventually led to the Diary of a CEO. But ultimately, it all began when I had this urge to sort of be a bit of an attention seeker. I think it might be this second child syndrome, when you're growing up and you see like how smart your brother is and how much attention he's getting from the accolades. And I was never the smartest person in the room. This was also back in the day where teachers would openly say that you're not the smartest person in the room. And so I sort of had to find a new way to channel like this urging me to get this attention and to like sort of express myself. And that's where I found originally from acting, and I fell in love with acting, and that was going to be my dream career for quite a few years as a young kid. And when you are that young and you're thrown into that world, you sort of are taught very harsh lessons quite early on about failure and not getting auditions and being rejected for the most, well, what can only be seen especially back in those days, as the stupidest reasons. For example, you being too chubby, for example, for a role. And so I found myself like dealing with rejection from a young age, and I always found myself wanting to force my way through this path. And then I was getting to a good stage. I was at an agency, I was performing in theatre, and one evening I was about to go out on stage, and I just got this sudden urge of stage fright, and it was terrifying for me because I'd never felt this feeling before of not wanting anyone to see who I was. And I'd done the performance because I wholeheartedly believe that if you say you're going to do it, you do it, and you do it to the best of your ability. But when I finished that performance, I said I'd never go back out on stage again. And I mean, so far I've kept to that word. I've never gone out. I've never revisited those acting roots. But at the time, I sort of had this merge of being fascinated by the DVD extras on all the films that I used to watch, and watching the behind the scenes on how these films were made. And you got to see this insight, this beautiful insight into how other stories are crafted and how films are made from so many different angles. And I fell in love with that, and I saw that as a calling to try and find a new way to grab people's attentions and find a new way to entertain people that didn't involve them staring at me. It can be all done behind the camera. And so that then took on many different paths throughout. I mean, I guess it is still a short career, but a lot of paths through that career into what I eventually do now, which is to make trailers for The Diary of a CEO.
When you're looking at those behind the scenes DVDs and videos, I remember doing it too. Star Wars Episode 2 was my first one. I loved it.
Yeah. Same. It was actually Star Wars, which is crazy.
Really?
Yeah.
Because that's exactly what I was going to ask you.
Yeah, it was. I think it was around the time, I guess, because around that time when I was feeling that was when Star Wars Episode 1 came out, and then 2, and then 3, and it was around that time where I guess technology was being in a way that hadn't really been used before, and then merging that with the storytelling aspects, and it was almost like, for me, Star Wars felt like the first time you could actually get a true insight into the behind the scenes process of a film. So yeah, it was Star Wars kicked it all off for me as well.
I love that. It's one of those such binding films for so many of us. But I know that we're kind of exploring what it was that brought you to, the world of video, but I want to go to this moment of stage fright, because from there you haven't been back in front of the camera. Why not? Why choose not to go back to, being a performer and staying behind the scenes? I got very personal, very, very deep, very quickly.
Yeah. I mean, it's one of those where the truth is there's probably a whole host of reasons. I think if you were to speak to a therapist, they would probably say, because I feel safe behind the camera. I guess that there has been a few times when I've been able to actually take a step back and almost dissect how I've got to where I am now, because I feel like that's important for like your career development, and almost to look back on how far you've come. And I think too many things align in my mind, of a sense that around the age of happening is also around the age of when you start caring a lot more what other people think about you. I mean, this is before like social media days, but it was still around your peers. And I guess where I grew up, I don't think it was ever seen as cool, but it particularly wasn't a good idea to be in my area, go to school I went to, and then do ballet on a Saturday. It was a football culture, it was a sports culture, and boys had to be lads, not like there was a lot more of a definition of what it was to be a young guy then. And I naturally didn't fall into that category. And I grew up, like, one of the earliest memories I always have is whilst my dad and my brother went off to watch West Ham, which is soccer team in the UK for those who might not know it. Do you say soccer or football here?
We say soccer, but I personally call it football and get into debates with people about it.
Yeah. So you should.
Yes.
And you should win those debates. No,
I absolutely do. Liverpool for life on my end.
So whilst they were going off and watching West Ham, I would be sat at home with my mum, and she would always put on some Disney films, or she would put on black and white films about nuns or something like that. So many different types of films. And that's and so growing up I was more of a mummy's boy, and I guess it sort of all came to this moment in time where you care a lot about what your peers think about you. You know you don't fit that mold, and you have that decision of which direction do you go. I think ultimately I still tiered towards the middle because I had an amazing group of friends who supported me, and my family always supported me. But I think ultimately that was the reason why. It wasn't because I just stopped love being an actor or love performing. I think it was that it was like what caring too much what other people would think of me, and it comes as a common, like I think a lot of actors are people pleasers, and that couldn't that defines me in so many ways. I've come to realize is that I'm almost like an extreme people pleaser to the extent where it can actually become detrimental and lead to what we'll talk about later, which is like with burnout. And when you're an extreme people pleaser and the majority want you to be this way, you can't help but slowly move towards that, and it's this constant battle between what you really like, who you really want to be, what you really are, and what society wants you to be. And so I guess that's the therapist answer, is that it's so much safer to be behind the scenes and to make things from afar. You push your work out there, but not people don't have to know that that's your work. And I guess that's that answer. But also is things change as you get older. I found a love with film, and ultimately what I loved about acting was I loved telling stories and I loved entertaining people, and I get to do that twice a week now, and I get to experiment and explore different styles and different ways of doing things and play with different emotions. And so for me to have that playground, that's a true love and that's a true purpose that I found. And so I've just not really got that need to go back into acting.
There's a joyfulness that clearly comes through on my end, like looking at you, down from the camera because we're remote here, but the dropped eye look when someone starts talking to you. But, there's a passion that is clearly articulated, and although you haven't fully stepped back onto that stage, there's this different type of stage that you've stepped into, and it might not necessarily be all about you and all eyes on you, but a lot of what you create and share in the public eye now features around DOAC, but also the process that you go through. And from an outsider's perspective, I've kind of got two things here. One is, you love and you're excited and you just enjoy sharing the work that you do. But there's also this element of showing up publicly, but in a way that is meaningful to you. Is this something that's encouraged for you now to share and put yourself out there and really highlight the work that gets created?
By Steve? Or in general?
Steve is obviously the head of the company, but just in general within sort of the culture that you're part of.
Yeah, I mean, one of the... what was crazy was when I left my old company, it was you cannot share anything about what you do. And again, as we lead, there's so many, what I've come to realize is there's so many fragments that can lead to burnout and to lead to a lack of purpose. And for me, that was one of them, was you could only have so much pride in your work, and not being able to then share that with people, I think that does niggle at you a bit. But when I came here, one of the first things I was told, and one of the first things I remember by Jack, who's the producer of the podcast, was share everything and be proud of your work. This is your work. That was then reciprocated with Steve saying, like, take this ownership. And to the extent where I would, when the trailers would then get released and someone would say a lovely comment about the work and how great the edit could be, Steve would then comment and tag me in the comments, say, this is the guy who done it. And then eventually I sort of found myself getting more and more connections on LinkedIn, the more people following me, the more I started sort of sharing a few little insights, because I've always had this sort of fire in me that I love teaching, and I love this idea of being able to share whatever, any wisdom or knowledge I might think I might have, because ultimately I wasn't taught any of this stuff, and I wish I was. I didn't really have role models in that traditional sense. What I had was film and behind the scenes, and I had to dissect that myself. And me and my ex business partner, when we had a company, that's how we learned about business. Was we had to dissect things from what we saw and what we heard from meetings, etc. And I just wanted to be able to give the opportunity to share what I've learned being self-taught. And absolutely, it's not even a case of the company saying we'll just let him do that. It was, let's actively share that. In our Slack channel where we all converse, we have a like a social sharing channel where whoever writes a post, whether it be LinkedIn or Instagram or Facebook, etc., you share it onto that channel, and then everyone in the company can interact with it and comment with it. And we've created this almost beautiful community within the company where the idea is that you support each other no matter what. And it started from the very top with Steve, and with people like with Jack and Grace Andrews and Grace Miller and Jem. All of these people were just commenting on your posts and sharing it and liking it and spreading that love, and that's funneled down now to absolutely everyone, which is what I absolutely love about it. So yeah, it is big part of our company culture.
You're painting a really beautiful contrast here, because you mentioned this just a moment ago about the company you were with previously and the roles that you've been part of. There's kind of this life here that a lot of creators dream of, but to get to there, it's been through its challenges. You've mentioned purpose a few times, and this is a core principle I know from kind of some of our earlier interactions, is the lead up to your burnout ties to your purpose. Take us back to what it was like before this burnout experience and working with some of the biggest companies in the world, but still not finding fulfillment.
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately it's very easy, in no matter what industry or part of life you're in, it's very easy to get distracted by the flashing neon lights. And when you, from an editor's perspective, when you're faced with the opportunity that you could be working for some of the biggest studios in the world, working on some of the biggest films in the world, you naturally assume that you've made it in your career and this is the dream. You know, you're working for these companies. And I remember when I was self-employed before all this, I remember speaking to a friend of mine who worked at a soccer team, which I won't mention the name, but he was working at a soccer team, and he was a supporter of them. He absolutely loved them. He lived in that area. It was like, it was done the traditional way where his family supported that team. He grew up there, and he got his dream job to work on the social side for this team. And he was so excited because it meant meeting all the players, meeting the manager, meeting the background staff, seeing all the games. And I think after about 6 months, he'd quit. And when I spoke to him, he said it got to the point where I was hating the team that I'd loved for 18, 19 years. And what I've come to realize is, from that sense, is that there is that saying where it's like, be careful with working with your heroes and meeting your heroes, etc. And there is a part of that, which is ultimately these heroes, these dream companies, they're companies like any other company. And the bigger they are, and the more chance that you love them because they're so big and they release so many films, etc. Chances are they're run a lot more cutthroat and less, what's and less, not like, they're run more cutthroat, and they probably care indirectly.
The care factor is
unintentionally.
lower than
The care factor
other
is a
places.
lot lower. Yeah, because ultimately they've got so many people, and when you become part of that machine, you do then become more and more of a number. I was different because I was working within an agency that worked within those brands, but then this idea of being this white labeled and not being able to share your work, and not, you're still given the same constraints. We do it this way and only this way. There was so many times where for other clients where you have to fight so hard to just try a new experiment, to try a new style, and if it don't work, the reality is you can go back, or you try again. And so many companies are fixed with that. And so I think ultimately these were starting like the stepping blocks of not losing that purpose. I wasn't being able to tell stories that I felt were important as well. You felt like you were entertaining people, but you were so far back from the result and showing them it. It's like you never really got that feeling of like, this is the work that I'm proud of, here it is, because the second it was done, you moved on to the next thing and no one knows you exist. And I think for me, that's where that lack of purpose came in, was I couldn't express how I wanted. I couldn't express and tell the stories that I wanted to tell as much as I wanted to, because there were so many constraints from the bigger brands. So yeah, ultimately that, plus with the way the media industry in particular works with budgets and constraints, you get pushed into this pressure cooker, and eventually, like with anything, it explodes, and it exploded for me.
I'm laughing right now because I can relate to every single word you're saying. Yeah. It's just this consistent reduce budget, create bigger output. If you're not going to do it for us, we'll just go find somebody else. There's this mistreatment of people within creative industries, and I think that, to your point, they forget that we are people, and there are things that need to happen.
Yeah, there's a lack of, and again, I'm not like, it's very easy to paint these like these brands and these studios as like evil people. They're not evil people. It's just the nature of what happens when you become so big or working in an industry with those constraints. But you just find, from an editor's perspective, there's the lack of trust. There's the lack of freedom. There's a lack of expression. And all of these things I think editors need, because I've always said there's a difference between a career and a job. And this is my weird way of explaining things. This is not like,
I love weird ways of explaining things, so you go for it.
It's not the Oxford definition of it. But the way I see it is like, a job is you work for your money. It has everything has pros and cons. That has its pros and cons. The pros of it is that you don't care about that job. You do your job, you get paid, you enjoy it all your weekends, you get your holidays, but there's no sense of purpose from your working life. I guess your purpose would then have to come from family, from friends, etc. And then you have a career. And I think if you want a career, that is very often full of highs, full of lows, and that is a purposeful driven route. And you have to have purpose in that, because otherwise you are being taken on a ride. If you don't enjoy it, you're going to feel sick, and you're going to feel just defeated at the end of it. And for a lot of editors, you choose a career. It's not a job. It's long hours, it's weekend work, it's late nights, it's constant rejection, it's constant failure. And you need to love what you do to face all of that. Otherwise, you're just getting all this negative energy, and it stores in you because you don't have that fight to want to push back and then find the pros of it. You just bring in all these cons. And I think that's where this misalignment has happened, and why there's so much of this creative burnout, is because we've got loads of people here with this burning burning desire with all this purpose, and yet they're just being met with this lack of trust and this lack of experimentation and this lack of expression. But you need that in order to drive this purpose forward. Otherwise, what is the purpose? What are you fighting for if you're not even allowed to do the bare fundamentals of why you got into this in the first place?
We're going to come back to experimentation in just a second. But at this point, I want to take us a little bit darker, a little bit deeper, and really understand from your perspective what you were feeling through your burnout experience. For the people listening, I just want to give you a little bit of context to this, because Ant put a post on his LinkedIn that broke down in very broad terms the process of going from burnout to not wanting to be a video editor anymore to being recommended into DOAC, and everything kind of carried on from there. But it's this moment that I want to come back to, when that creative spark that you felt diminished, went out, and help the people understand that, for people that, like yourself, who've come back and created incredible careers, that point doesn't have to be the end. So if you can share your experience in that moment, would be incredibly valuable to so many people.
Of course. So I've come to realize that your career and your work and your colleagues and your job, all of this is so similar to the fundamentals of what I think it is to live a happy life, and that's relationships. And ultimately, if a relationship falls down, potentially it's one of the hardest things that you go through. And I think there's almost this stigma with work that it's just a job, and you find another one, and why are you worried about it? It's just a job. It don't mean anything. The boss don't care about you. They'll find someone else in 10 seconds. They'll put out feelers and stuff like that. And what I think people forget to realize is the reality of it is, if you're going for a career, that's very different again to this idea of a job. And a career is very much like this relationship. Like a relationship, you pour so much of yourself into your career. There's an identity with your work. There's the way you present yourself comes through your work. And when you're in a relationship that's constantly not feeding you the core basics and the fundamentals that you need to strive in a relationship, eventually you will break down. And that's no different to a career. If you're not given those basic fundamentals, you will eventually lose hope, and you will lose sight on why you've done this in the first place. And then inevitably, like it did with me, it leads to the breakup, in this case with work, with a burnout. And prior to that, in the weeks building up to it, it always feels like a snap. But the reality of it is, if you go back, like with a breakup, this started 6 months ago. And it's only when you start looking back on it on when you're in the more brighter days, is when you realize what happened and how it happened. And the build up to what then ultimately led to burnout was being overworked, not being able to express myself. That purpose was just dying and dying and dying. And you don't realize it because you always feel like you should be lucky. You should always feel like you're lucky to be working in this industry. You're lucky that you've got a roof over your head. You're lucky, and on some sense it is, but it is human. It is your human condition. It's innate in us that you can't just throw everything aside and be like, oh well, I'm lucky because I've got a job. You have these fundamentals that need to be met. And in the build up before I left, I found myself having regular panic attacks. I would literally be working and crying at the same time because I couldn't take 10 minutes out of my schedule to just go into a corner and cry and let it out, because I was that busy, and I felt like that I'd get fired, or whatever it was, or that I was letting everyone down. And so you find yourself crying as you're working. And I wasn't seeing family. I wasn't present with my girlfriend. I wasn't seeing friends. I wasn't doing anything, because I just felt like as soon as I woke up, I had to work, sleep, work, sleep. And obviously you're not sleeping that much because you're working a lot. And like I say, like with a relationship, if you have this over and over again, you crumble and you collapse from that. And it reminded me very much of a time when I was going through a difficult relationship problem, and I'd got diagnosed with depression, and I was on those pills that turn you into a zombie just to try and keep you level-headed to make decisions and to live through life. And you feel a bit dead inside, and you're pretending that you're sick all the time by lying in bed. The only difficult I had with this one is I felt like I couldn't say I felt ill because I had to work. If I did feel ill, I was working anyway. And all of that led to the moment where I just gave up. And and it was difficult for me because ultimately I was working with people I really liked. You know, my creative director at the time, one of the greatest mentors I've ever had, still is. And he's one of the kindest guys I've ever had, and he supported me and he helped me. It just couldn't maintain with the powers above that. But even like the boss of the agency was very kind to me when I announced it, and he was there for me. But ultimately it was too late then, and it just leaves you with this idea of, like, when you break up, you think you'll never meet anyone again. I thought I'd never want to do this job again. It wasn't fun. It wasn't exciting. You feel let down and annoyed with yourself because you've spent, at that point, I would have spent about 20 odd years dreaming of this career, and like that, it's not worked, and you hit the rock bottom and you feel like you're at your lowest wits, and it's like, well, there's no coming up from this. So it literally was, I was talking to Helena, my girlfriend at the time, and I was looking at jobs which was just 9 to 5 in admin, or being a train. I was looking into how can I become a train driver, or just any job that I had no interest in prior to this, just because I felt that's what I needed to be happy. And both Helena and my mum and dad were just like, just take a bit of time, because I can tell you're gonna hate those jobs. You are not born to be in that type of job. You are born to be creative. You are born to tell stories. What you do is amazing. Just because you've hit this blimp, it doesn't mean that you can't find the passion again. And then weirdly, I think literally a few days later, I saw the ad for the Diary of CEO, that they were looking for a promo editor at the time. And I applied a couple of different ways because I wanted to make sure that I at least got a chance. Booked in a 20-minute meeting with Jack that turned into a 2-hour meeting on New Year's Eve. And I then came into this company. I admit I was still feeling the effects of burnout. It's like anything, you think you're over it, but it takes a long time. It can take up to like 6-7 months, depending how long this burnout's been brewing. So I was nervous and I was scared. I'd lost all that spark in me. I didn't know if I was going to be able to do this. And they put trust in me, and they gave me that ownership, and then that purpose came back. And then because I was able to share the work that I'd done and see the work that I've done, we had this amazing community of the DOAC fans who would comment how great the work is, or how this is like a Netflix trailer, or how this is better than Hollywood, and how it's like this. And it's it's ultimately the reason why I love the Diver CEO community so much is my mum, dad, and Helena saved me from the brink of never returning to the industry and never doing what I loved. But the DOAC fans and the DOAC community, they proved to me that I am doing the right thing and that I need to keep doing this because of the love that they shared. And we always talk about on LinkedIn, on sites, on just how amazing the community are and how much we touch them. And I get loads of messages from people saying how much the podcast helps them. But I've never really, until this moment, saying this, realised just how much the community has given us, and the purpose the community has given me means that I can keep doing what I love every day and release something two times a week and grow in an industry that I thought I'd never return to. So yeah, so it's I owe a lot to that community.
I want to just take a moment here to acknowledge your vulnerability in those last few minutes, because that is so powerful for so many people. And having known a lot of people that have gone through burnout, creator burnout especially, and having gone through it myself, like that hit the feels. I've felt that. I've had my breakdown moments. It's one of those things where you feel like you're alone at that point, but your story proves that we're not. And I think that deserves acknowledgement for what you share and the openness as part of this series, which I'm incredibly grateful for. As we continue this journey, there's another contrast you've painted through your story, which is, you know, this aspect of loneliness, but the community that you've built around you. And I really want to get this feeling, this spirit of community. And what is it like when you're the creator, whether you know, for the people listening, whether they're freelancer or, you know, as part of an agency, when you have that community around you, whether it's other creatives, whether it's, you know, people you're watching on the internet, whether you're watching this interview, how does that spirit of community then start to lift you up and empower creativity within you and the stories that you create and the experiments that you try?
Yeah. I mean, I'll say this. On my platforms, I share what I tend to say is one of the most invaluable tips or hack to becoming an editor is the role of storytelling and how that influences so much of what you do. And that really is one of the biggest tips I can offer to any editor from a career perspective. But actually, from a human perspective, the biggest piece of advice that I can offer any creative or any content creator, whether it's an editor, copywriter, social media manager, or anyone in any industry, if you want to succeed in your career, if you want to succeed in life, you need to try really hard to build a community of people around you that will support you in the low times and in the high times. I wouldn't be where I am today in life in terms of my mental health and how I feel if I didn't have the friends that I've grabbed hold of and kept since my sixth form college days. I wouldn't have the strength to do what I do weekly if it wouldn't be for my family and my mum and dad constantly reminding me that I've gone through this so many times and I've said it's the end of the world for me, it's the end. They will bring it up, and at the time it's so annoying. Every time I mention something. So at the moment it could be buying a house, and if I go through the process of wanting to buy a house, without fail, my mum and dad would be like, oh, remember that time when you said you would never buy a house because it's so expensive and you won't ever get there. You're going to have to move all the way to like the north of England. Remember that? Now look. And at the time, it's so fucking annoying. But
parents have a knack for that.
They do. But, and at the time, you just think, it's like, they're just so desperate to get one up on you and to prove that they were right. But in retrospect, it's this constant reminder of, yes, you felt that, and look at where you are now. It's almost giving you that retrospect before you have to almost go down this self journey to try and figure that out for yourself. I've got people who will literally remind me every other week of how bad I thought it was and how good it is now. And you need that. I need that constant reminder, because naturally, especially as well in the times that we're in, it's very easy to fall into that depth of despair, that nothing is great, everything's collapsing around us, the career that I loved is diminishing and vanishing, and I'll never find purpose. It's good to have them say, hold on, you said that 6 months ago, look at you now. Like, let's start thinking more positive. So if I didn't have them, if I didn't have Helena, if I didn't have my friends, and if I didn't have all the other family around me, I wouldn't be the person I am today. But the beauty is I've managed to add to that list with the people I now work with, who I do consider them friends. I know sometimes people are like, oh, you shouldn't call your work colleagues your friends or family, blah, blah, blah. For me, I think that's bullshit. You work with these people every single day. We go into the office every single day. I'm seeing them all the time. What people like Liv and Berta on the production team, Liv is who I'm training up at the moment to take over and do the trailers. Having her by my side every single day is a godsend, because of her infectious energy and her enthusiasm and her tenacity and the urgency just to do so well. That just rubs off on me all the time, and it goes, you know what, yeah, we will do this and we'll do it. She comes up with the idea. If there's a moment where I'm like, oh, gonna have to work a little bit later tonight, it's frustrating because I worked a little bit later the other night, she's like, do it. And we do it and we love it.
Go
and we have
for
fun.
it. Yes.
Exactly. And if I wouldn't be the person I am without her, and then I wouldn't be the person I am today without Jack and without Steve and Georgie and CB and Grace Andrews and Miller and Berta and Cam now and Ross and Lish and Will, all these people that I love. And now I also have the beauty of the DOAC community and those fans, and I've been trying to focus a lot more on LinkedIn on growing a bit of an audience, so I can help show that for editors you don't have to go to university or go to a film school, or you don't even have to have had this ingrained passion from a young age to be an editor. You can pick things up if you learn this, like almost like skill stacking other elements that can go into editing. But that community keeps me going, because they do pick you up when you're down, and they do remind you that what you're doing is great. And even today we've just released a trailer, and I'll go through the comments and I'll read through it, and I saw one on the thing saying like, your editor's amazing. And there's that bit where it's the imposter syndrome in me is like, oh, I hate it, but then straight away it changes to, wow, someone's just given me a compliment, and that makes your day. And you go into, I'm going into making another trailer with so much energy and so much fire, because of that one thing that person said, reminding me that I can do this job. So when I talk about the biggest advice being storytelling, that's true for career, but from a life perspective, build a community around you and build relationships with people who are there for you during your highs and during your lows, because ultimately they will save your life.
For the people listening and the people that want to be better storytellers, to empower these conversations, and perhaps even to the level that you've got it to, or to the next level, wherever that ends up being, what do you say to them in improving their flow of storytelling to kind of enhance that ability and that skill set to help them take their next steps?
I mean, it's twofold. You've got the if I was to write a self-help book approach, which is I would pick up any basic human psychology book and I'll read it cover to cover, because ultimately to tell stories and to market products or to market your content, you're going to have to know how the human mind works and how humans react to certain things and different emotions, and what emotion do you want to capture to lead to this action that relates to your product or to your brand, etc., etc. So that's one of the first things I would say from the self-help book approach. The other approach I would say to that is obviously just keep trying, just keep writing stories, just watch films, read books. These are literal stories. Read the news. The news is stories. Everything we touch is stories. So just ingrain yourself and just sort of take a more analytical approach, especially in the industry that you're in, but also the industries that you aren't in. When we created the trailers that we have now for the Diary of a CEO, there weren't trailers like this. It was clips thrown together, maybe with a bit of music, but it didn't have this coherent feel. There wasn't this emphasis on emotion or narrative or anything like that. All I simply done was see what worked in other industries, which has been going on for years. We still see film trailers every single day. The Deadpool and Wolverine trailer was, I think, like the most watched trailer, like in the quickest amount of time in history. We've been having trailers since the 50s or something. Like, we've been having trailers for so long, and yet people are still breaking records to watch the new Deadpool and Wolverine trailer, knowing that the film's going to come out in like 6 months. But they still want to watch it, and they still want to be excited by it. And it works so well in that industry still, to the extent that theatre productions do it, books do it, TV shows do it, and podcasts just never really saw it in that way. And I think part of it is because they think it's a very expensive process, and etc., etc. So all I took was something that worked so well from an industry and tested to see if it worked here, and it ultimately built this community of people wanting to watch these trailers and messaging me saying I'll wait on the Monday and Thursdays to watch these trailers, because it feels so different to like other social media content that we see. And I mean, I have no idea how factually accurate this is, but I even had someone tell me the other day that they have ADHD and they love the trailers from an ADHD perspective, because it's one of the first social contents that just keeps them engaged throughout, and it just keeps them active and excited throughout. And I never even thought of that. Again, I don't know how that's a personal opinion from someone who's got ADHD, but even that was amazing to hear. And so that's ultimately like the self-help book approaches. Read up on human psychology, learn what's happening in other industries and in your industry, what works, what doesn't work, and just engross yourself from an analytical standpoint about storytelling. Now, from the more holistic approach, which sounds difficult but can become easy, is we literally live our lives by telling and hearing stories. That's literally how we consume news. That's how we consume social media. That's how we live our lives. That's when we used to go to bed at night, our parents would read us stories. We've been hearing stories our whole lives, but we've never paid attention to it to the extent of using it as a career tool and using it as a way to like enhance your career in the industry that you're in. And it doesn't take a lot to just listen more to what people are saying to you. Listen to how I listen so much now on how my dad talks about what he done at the weekend, because my dad is one of those who will literally recite dialogue said from that night. He wouldn't be like, oh yeah, we went here, then we went here, and we went here. He would be like, so we left the stadium and then we was walking. He was like, are you hungry? Yeah, I'm hungry. Okay, let's go and get a grab to eat. And then we walked, and then we just saw this little pub on the corner. And then we went up to this pub, and the food was amazing. And we done this, and there's like the service was a bit slow, but there's like, and then we got a phone call, And he was like, are you hungry? It was like, yeah, we're hungry. And he's doing these dialogues and he's exchanging. This is just him telling what he'd done on a weekend.
Playing every character in this story.
Exactly, playing every. And it's amazing how many people do that. And if you just take a step back and fully listen to it, you will realize that this person's creating a beginning and a middle and an end. They'll create some sort of conflict. They'll create characters that you'll like or dislike. And this is happening all around us all the time. So just take that step back and truly listen to what people are saying. And over time, I do believe that the more and more you listen and the more and more you read, the more and more you do something, you will start becoming ingrained in naturally feeling like, okay, I need to start with this. Oh, this makes me feel this way. Maybe we stop it here. Maybe we'll do that. And then ultimately you're starting to build these stories yourself.
There's a really famous saying that is, to be the most interesting person in the room, you have to be the most interested. Which, for that, like, you've summed it up perfectly in this kind of captivating version.
If I knew that quote, I would have saved about 10 minutes of me waffling, but yeah, I guess so.
The waffle was worth it, I can promise you that. What I do want to ask here, though, is everything that you've created and the steps that you've taken now, how does it feel to be the trendsetter of podcasting? It's a big statement, I know.
It's terrifying. I don't know. I mean, it's literally it was all the emotions. At first, it was fear, especially from someone like me who, I mean, I do believe in imposter syndrome. I think it's a very real thing. I do think that
absolutely
it's not the be all and end all. I think you can actually use imposter syndrome, and I think I've inadvertently used imposter syndrome my entire life to do things like even just playing soccer, even just playing soccer. It's the fear of embarrassment which made me think, you know what, I'm just gonna not stop running. I'm gonna pass instead of shoot when there's someone in that box. I'm gonna do it, and then ultimately you become a better and better player for doing that. And it's the same with the career with imposter syndrome. And I think that really helped me at the start, because when you start hearing people saying that you've set this trend, my fear is instantly like, oh shit, people are now looking at us, at what we do. Everything I'm doing is getting analysed. And then I started seeing posts and then TikTok videos of people saying, like, doing breakdowns of the trailers. And it's crazy because I'd never even thought about it in that much detail outwards before. It was all in my head at the time and how I would explain it to Liv, but I'd never actually written this detailed analytical approach to how I do the trailers. And then articles were being made, and then people were commenting on it, and then people were then sending me the trailers that they were making. And it started off with this fear. I was terrified, and then it started turning into anger, if I'm completely honest, because it was almost like, hold on, I've worked so hard for this, and now you guys are just going to copy it? Like, come on. But then, again, you realize that is the biggest form of flattery on the planet. Yep. And again, it's the imposter syndrome and the fear that's probably leading to that anger. And then you start realizing it's like, actually, no, it's because people have seen what you've done, have been inspired by it, and want to test it out themselves, or they've gone on your LinkedIn, seen how you can make it, and then started recreating it. And that's incredible. And like, I now, as much as I can, whenever someone sees it, I always try and watch it, and I'll always try and interact and engage with it, because that's a beautiful thing. And so it's a weird journey, the whole trend thing. And ultimately, look, the Diary of a CEO became this juggernaut and is massive because of so many other people. And I played the tiniest part of the growth of the Diary of a CEO. The work that's been done behind the scenes with the experimentation, with thumbnails, with the ordering of the actual episode, how Steve talks to the guests, how the social team market it, what the distribution teams have been doing with bringing them so it goes on flights, that it goes on Samsung TV, for example. All of these, I mean, the research team just blow my mind. Like Ross, who sits opposite me, I get this beautiful insight into the research process just from just watching him and seeing how much he reads, and it's incredible. And so it's nice to be called a trendsetter. I mean, for someone who's as famously uncool as I am, I never thought in a million years I'd set a trend, especially not in like fashion. But and so it's an amazing feeling, but ultimately it's very humble to realize that I'm doing I'm just this small piece in such an amazing team doing amazing things and setting the trends. They're the trendsetters. What they're doing, they're changing the game, and it's just an honor to be part of that.
Through all of this, you're a very humble human being. That's abundantly clear, which is nice. It's great to have a conversation with someone who acknowledges the support and the kind of community around everything that you do. You've mentioned this a couple of times, but do you still get imposter syndrome even with everything that has been achieved so far?
100%. Every single day. And part of it, I think, is this need to be an extreme people pleaser, which I'm currently working on, because I say extreme because I think being a people pleaser is not a bad thing. I sort of have this weird feeling with people who are just like, they don't care what anyone thinks. That sometimes that worries me a little, because if you don't care what people think, then ultimately then you probably don't care what you say, or you don't care how they feel, and then that could be a slippery slope into like not having that much compassion, etc. But I'm also on the extreme end of, there's like a few people in my life where if I upset them, piss them off, it'll ruin my day, and it'll make me unproductive. And so I do still get imposter syndrome, because it's ultimately when you don't want to sit back and just start coasting. You want to keep building on this. And what I love is, like, we have this mantra, which is the 1% every day, which is literally on my cap, which actually got given to me when Steve was doing a talk in New Zealand, I think. And it's this idea of every project, every trailer I work on, I try and find something that I can just be 1% better at, whether it's sound, dialogue, pace, an After Effects effect, anything that I can just do. And when you look back from the first trailer I ever made, I actually think it's quite embarrassing to watch, because in my head it's so bad compared to what we make now in the same time frame, etc. And I've now started implementing the 1% into like my everyday life and things like that, and I think that inherently builds imposter syndrome, because I wake up and think, okay, what do I have to do to be better today? What do I have to do to make this trailer better? And that insets the imposter syndrome, because you're sort of worried, what if I can't do this? What if I'm out of my depth? And you just sort of have to lean into it. And that gives you the fire and the fight to do ultimately the best work and live the best life you can.
So with this theme of 1% better every day, tell me the story of how the QR code in the medical ID badge came about.
Oh,
I did do some research before this conversation.
Wow, you did. It was crazy, because often enough, you get this beautiful feeling that 1% don't always have to be a search. 1% can essentially be. My camera keeps shaking. I think someone keeps shaking the booth. Ultimately, 1% can naturally happen. And so what you find is with the QR code, it was essentially, how can I find a cool way to introduce every guest? And the guest that we had on in question wasn't huge. Like, she hadn't done TV interviews everywhere. She hadn't done loads of podcasts. There wasn't as much footage about her. So I was a little bit more limited. And the challenge was, how can I create as an exciting intro card without that sort of footage? And ultimately what I found was that she was a doctor working in a hospital, and I started researching a cool way to introduce her name, and I found that doctors wear name tags. And I found this one picture of an American hospital, and she was American, where they have like these logos or QR codes on their badge, and then you scan them and it gave you more information about those guests, etc., etc. And I just thought, this is a perfect opportunity to really represent who her character is. So I created this medical ID badge, and I just had this QR code, and I was like, why not do something with the QR code? Like, it's a pointless it being wasted. And so I done it so then when you scan the QR code, it takes you to the Diary CEO YouTube page, where you can then go and watch the full video. And the idea is that you don't shout about it. It weren't it wasn't so much a talking point of the trailer itself, but it was almost like this nice little Easter egg that for those who are curious, who had maybe seen it enough times, and I wonder what that does, it leads to somewhere and it leads to that goal. And that ultimately then led to that 1%, because it was just like another way to almost take you to a platform.
I love the whole idea, and you mentioned Deadpool and Wolverine before. They dropped a QR code between Wolverine's legs as he was walking in a trailer. To that behind the scenes, I'm like, I swear they copied Ant on that one.
If only.
Yeah, if only. Let's just play along for the moment. There's one more spirit of, or theme, I should say, of everything that you've been doing for so long through your own journey and through DOAC and the work you do. You've mentioned it a couple of times, and I think 1% better every day is a perfect encapsulation of this, and it's experimentation. What is your approach towards experimentation, not just from the practical perspective? I feel like we've got a pretty good understanding of you from there, but from this mindset perspective, in how experimentation and this mindset of experimentation plays such a vital role in your creativity.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, like we've touched on it before, but from a company perspective, it's known that experimentation plays such a huge role in our company, and that's ultimately the reason why we've grown so fast in the way that we have, and now why we've created Flight Studio, which is to take all the lessons learned from those experiments to then unleash onto other podcasts so they can hopefully have the same growth. And so there's that element to it. But I think from a personal perspective, experimentation's so important because it just keeps you wanting more, and it stops you from just sitting back and coasting. And it's the ultimate thing, really. Like with the trailers, you could potentially, from a broader view, look at the trailers as if they've never changed. Like, oh, we always have a hook, we always have a cliffhanger. Oh, Steve's made a guest cry. You sometimes see those comments, and it's like, why does Steve always make the guest cry, etc., etc., etc. But it's when you sort of narrow in, so many trailers have these tiny little experiments, whether they're being aspects of it are being fully measured, as in we've given it to the experimentation team and we're looking at very subtle aspects that work or don't work. For example, we would test if a progress bar works for example, whether that increases retention, whether it does or doesn't, text, etc. But I always try and find new experiments that I can just perform for me to test out to see if that works. And ultimately, that's where the hook came from. That's where the cliffhanger came from. Was we'd put a cliffhanger in one. I remember that still think I've got this text between me and Helena, and it was talking about me putting a cliffhanger in the trailer, and I think I put two cliffhangers in, and I was texting her, and I was panicking because I was like, what if no one gets this? What if they just think it's just cut off and it's pointless? And it's like, what if it just creates so much anger? And she was like, it's fine. Just if it doesn't work, just go back to telling a cohesive round story. And then we released the cliffhangers, and then it has now become the thing that we're known for, is that we create these cliffhangers. And again, it's playing into the human psychology of, why would you want to give everything away in the trailer? We want people to go and watch the episode. And so that in itself was an experiment that worked. There's been experiments that I've done that haven't worked. It'll be things like playing around with the length of the hook, for example. And ultimately, there's so many variables that sometimes it's quite difficult to do a purpose-led experiment. These are the results. We're doing that more and more as we can. But if you're an editor, you should always, from a holistic perspective, always have this mindset of being a scientist, which we've heard a few times from the guests that we've had on. And it is ultimately looking at what you think works, what doesn't work, testing if there's other ways you can do it, and then seeing how that reacts. And one of those could be the music that you use, whether it's the music in the hook. Do people like the music at the hook? Do people not like the music in the hook? And you can test that. We've tested that before, where we've had the same hook with music, without music, and we found that with music the retention was longer across these trailers. And then you sort of read through the comments, but then if all the comments were saying, I fucking hate rock music, I hate this music, I would then start experimenting with different types of music from something that I might have heard elsewhere from a different trailer on a film, or how I felt. And then ultimately you sort of see that starts working more, and that brings more energy, and then you start using that style a little bit more. So experimentation is key to just keep growing as an editor, or in any walks in life, even like out of your career. So I mean, we're a big believer in it as a company culture thing, but I believe everyone should just be running these tiny little experiments as much as they can, no matter how small you think it is. And the idea is, I always used to think experimentation had to be big enough for people to notice, and it's actually the opposite. I want to make them so small that people don't notice it, because if they don't notice it, it means it's not taking their attention away from the trailer, for example, or it means that it's worked in the way that I want it to work. And so doing these tiny little experiments, I think, will just elevate your career and your work to another level.
Just before we wrap this up, you've shared so much and been so vulnerable through this conversation, which is, I know I'm immensely grateful for, and the people watching this I know will be immensely grateful for. As we sort of draw to a close, I want to take a 2020 hindsight view backwards. And with this spirit of experimentation in mind, everything that you've gone through, the ups, the downs, the peaks of the mountains, the bottom of the valleys, how has experimentation played a role through all of these experiences that has brought you to the purpose that you've found, that's ignited that spark? And I'm going to say it's more than a spark, it's an inferno at this point. that it's just given you this whole life and energy that is exciting to move forward with in a creative industry.
I mean, I've not actually thought about it till you just said that, but I guess I've been experimenting my whole life, right? With going back, I started off acting, and then I moved into it was like full on acting. Then it moved into performance, so it was like doing ballet and tap and all of these things are like these are little life lessons, but life lessons are experiments because you learn from it whether you succeed or whether you fail. And I guess ultimately what I've learned is that I've always been experimenting subjectively, and I think so many people have been experimenting subjectively in their life. But I think when you take ownership of that, and when you realize that, you can then turn these subconscious life lessons, experimentations that are happening anyway, and you can then just really use it to your advantage. If I knew what I know now about experimentation, I sure as hell would have done things differently at uni when I was making films. I sure as hell would have taken a lot more risks when I owned a company. I mean, in hindsight, I probably played that so safe because I was so scared of going broke that I didn't take enough risks there. And ultimately, those risks could have, who knows what career I could have had if I took those risks there. And I guess ultimately, knowing what I know now is that unless it's jumping off a cliff, the experimentation's not going to kill you. Unless your experiment is, should I touch this high voltage wire? That's not experimenting. That's stupid.
Yeah.
Experimenting and going, should I do this job? Should I take on this job for 6 months? And if I love it, great. If I don't, go and find another job. If you take that experiment, is that going to kill? No. If anything, it's going to give you such a valuable life lesson. We had someone who recently worked with us and he wasn't here the longest amount of time, and he left, and ultimately it was because for whatever reason it just didn't align with him. And I remember saying to him, I was like, if anything, that's actually a beautiful thing, because you've realized now more what you do want than what you don't want. And so many people realize what they don't want, and they struggle to find that true purpose in their life and what's going to make them happy, because they're not fixated on what they do want. And the only way you find what you do want is from experimentation. And so you need to have it in your life no matter what you're doing, even if it's going on a date. That in itself is an experiment. Like, you having a hypothesis of whether I'll like this person. You experiment by actually going on the date, and you learn, is it successful? Did it fail? And then if it failed, what do you take from those failures? Is it that it was a personality issue? Was it that, the date went well, but the venue was shit and I couldn't get to know her well enough? Okay, second experiment, let's go to a restaurant instead of a rave. So like, it's these are life experiments, and I wish I knew that when I was growing up, because I would have done more experiments, would have taken bigger risks, and ultimately would have been, I guess, arguably in a better position than I am now, because I would have had so much more life experience at that point.
Those reflective moments and the real look backs to see what can be different, but acknowledging that it has happened, I always find are so incredibly powerful. And the 2020 hindsight kind of exercise is one I love doing so much. It's something that I kind of regularly do in my life, to go, what have been the wins? What have been the losses? What have I learned from recently? And so your perspective has perfectly encapsulated the spirit of that question. So thank you so much for that. And this conversation, I know for me, has been incredibly joyful. It's had its ups and downs and emotions and everything. It's been fantastic to have this with you. For the people watching and listening to this, where can they connect with you and see more of this journey that you're on?
I think if you're on LinkedIn, which I think every single person who wants a career should be, you can find me on LinkedIn, just Anthony Smith. you can connect with me on Instagram, but that is literally more of a I literally call it like it's my idea of a memory album. Is so I can look back, and it's again it's an important part I think of life is having these sort of tools that you can look back on quickly and remind yourself, whether it's a journal, whether it's using Instagram in that way. So you can also connect with me on there. And then if you want to see my work, it's out twice a week, Monday, Thursday, on the Diary of a CEO, whether it's on YouTube, Spotify, on Steve's socials. So yeah, that's how you find me.
I appreciate that, and I do encourage everybody to go and connect with Ant, because there's so many great things that get shared on there. Like, just from a learning perspective, I know that I've looked at it and gone, I didn't think of it that way. So there's so many amazing things that you share on there, which is great. And I appreciate you coming on to this series. Everything that you've shared is so purposeful in connecting with the whole spirit of this conversation that's being created to help creators just not feel alone through this burnout process and know it doesn't have to happen. So your contribution, this conversation, it's greatly appreciated.
Thank you so much for having me.